Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in layers of turbulence of all kinds these days. And it can feel overwhelming, paralytic, depressing. It's really hard to find action points when you're facing complex challenges that don't have sort of a beginning, middle, and end kind of architecture. And many of the challenges we face now, whether it's reducing poverty, reducing cruelty in our food systems, reducing global warming, whether it's reducing poverty, oh, sorry, reducing cruelty in our food systems, reducing global warming. Happening? Make sure there's no open windows on your screen other than the one we're on. I don't know why that started. There's no open windows on your screen other than the one we're on. I don't know why that started. There's no open windows on your screen other than the one we're on. Let's just pause for a second until we figure that out. There's no open windows on your screen other than the one we're on. Let's just pause for a second until we figure that out. There's no open windows on your screen other than the one we're on. Let's just pause for a second until we figure that out. Hold on one second. Windows on your screen other than the one we're on. Let's just pause for a second until we figure that out. Hold on one second. Windows on your screen. So, the one we're on. Let's just pause for a second. Do you see any open screens on your computer?
I'm closing them.
So, yeah, that's the problem. Let me just mute your. Sorry, everybody. We're gonna reboot in a second. We just have to make sure there's no open screens because we get sort of an endless loop process going. I just muted things for the moment. Let's try again. I think maybe we're okay. All right. Reboot. And actually, this actually gets to some of the complexities we all live with these days. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in layers of turbulence of all kinds. We've got a war, 2 wars underway, plus the wars you never hear about in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. The world is warming because of human activities. Communities are vulnerable. We have food systems that are not sustainable. We have social systems and political systems that aren't feeling very sustainable right now. And that can lead to a sense of paralysis, a sense of internal turmoil and confusion about how do you work? How do you wake up in the morning and get things done? And that's why I'm really happy to have Zoe Weil on today. A neighbor here in Maine who works has an Institute for Humane Education that works globally, particularly with educators, to build the capacity for teachers and students to find efficacy amid complexity. And solutionary is a word that Zoe has come up with over the years to capture this philosophy and set of practices. And she has a book out, The Solutionary Way. She has other books out as well. Just Google for her name, Zoe Weil, and you'll find a lot of resources. And we're going to discuss what it means to be a solutionary, how that practice works, what are some of the challenges and opportunities, and some examples of how this has played out, whether it's in classrooms or elsewhere. Zoe, it's really good to have you here. And it's been a challenging couple of days for my family because of the loss of a canine member of our family, and dogs and animals are having a truly humane relationship with other creatures is part of your philosophy too. So it's good to see you.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, Andy. Thank you so much for having me. And I have to tell you that I did not coin the word solutionary, but as soon as I heard it, I was all over that word.
And what was it about the word that lured you in?
Well, I should say that I know that, maybe 10% of the people, and this is from actually doing market research, really don't like the word. But when I first heard that word, and it was coined independently by a former executive director at the Institute for Humane Education, and also somebody who worked with Grace Lee Boggs, and I heard it and I thought it just resonated. It made me think that we needed that word. And we needed that word because it was bigger and bolder than problem solver. And,
Right.
like an engineer can solve the problem of blowing up a mountaintop for coal removal, but they're not a solutionary. And what defines a solutionary is not just looking for the root and systemic causes of problems and solving them at the causal level, but also an ethical foundation of doing the most good and the least harm for everyone. And by everyone, I mean people, animals, and the environment. So it's a
Right.
loaded term for doing good.
Right. And one thing that attracted me to it and to your work is it's more of a practice than a like when you get something in the mail from like a new printer like the one I'm looking at. It comes with instructions and then you're done. You've built something and you're done. I think a lot of us have this sense of problems mostly fitting that kind of architecture. I need to fix the faucet. I fixed a faucet not long ago. And this is one thing I've learned about sustainability in 40 years of writing about it is we're on a journey. And an approach that can work is to facilitate how that journey plays out. What are the characteristics and properties of the people making the journey in the systems? And so it's different than fixing something. And here, if your kind of mission statement here, we have the means to solve our conflicts without violence, to feed all of humanity without cruelty to animals, the oppression of people or the destruction of the environment, and to live harmoniously on a wondrous planet. And that now the question is, here's what's the practice? How do you take those grand goals and cut pieces or decide how do we approach that daily life and the particularities of things with that big idea in mind?
Yeah, it absolutely is a practice, and it's not to say that we can't come up with a solution and be done, presuming that we shifted a system and things are working better. We'll probably have to revisit it, but the solutionary practice that I talk about in my book is based on a 4-phase process, what we call a solutionary framework. And this is a framework that we have been bringing to schools and to teachers, and we're working with teachers and schools across the globe who are educating their students to be solutionaries using this 4-phase process. And that process is something that any of us can cultivate. So the first phase of that process is to identify a problem that you want to solve. And that could sound pretty obvious, but
Yeah.
I'm imagining people who are listening right now want to solve the problem of climate change. Well, that's really a huge problem and probably not something that somebody who's watching is just going to be able to say, well, yeah, that's the problem I'm going to solve. And now I'm going to just solve it. That we often need to identify a feasible aspect of
Right.
a big problem that we actually have the capacity to solve that's within our sphere of influence. So that first phase of identifying a problem is actually researching, learning, thinking, looking at what our sphere of influence is and what aspect of it we can take on. Do you want me to jump into all of the phases yet or
Not quite yet. No, I think we'll start with that general idea.
yeah.
And that meshes a lot with why I call this thing I do sustain what? Because words like sustainability have no action point. They're just sort of emblems more than something with meaning until you say sustain what?
Yep.
For whom? How? And then things get crystalline and you can start to say, oh, and that leads to some of your other parts of the practice too, like thinking about side effects and trade-offs and the like. I want to just show I did get an advanced look at the book and I wrote a blurb and I'm just going to show the blurb because and I'll read it too. I do find that the Solutionary Way is an inspiring and wonderfully usable guide to living a virtuous and productive life in a fast forward century that seems designed to confuse, paralyze, and divide. And I love your focus on progress making as a practice and a mindset, not gauged through some foreseen set of measurable outcomes. I think that's a really important part of this too. When you talk about a problem and a solution, you're talking about something you already have in your head,
Mhm.
like the faucet is broken, as opposed to how do we have fair access to water in our city, and onward and onward. And I think if even the other thing I like, of course, and I've said this many times about climate change, is the complexity and wickedness of climate change is what's daunting about it, but it's also what provides an entry point for everyone, whether you're a teacher or an artist or a scientist or an engineer or an entrepreneur. Find your part of that prism and dig in. So that's why, I'm not embracing this book because we're friends or anything else. I really like this approach to the world as we know it right now, and the world as it's going to be. Let me go. So here's before we get into breaking it into the pieces, though. You did mention this too. The word I do wonder sometimes because I've dealt with new words like the Anthropocene, which I helped to essentially create as a term. Does the world need a new word? The Anthropocene has become interesting because of the conversations around it. So on your website there, Institute for Humane Education, you do have some answers to what is a solutionary, and so why do we need this new word?
So I think I started to answer that when I talked about the word. I think
Yeah,
that we need it because there isn't another word that sums up all
oops,
that
sorry.
solution all that solutionary sums up. So,
Right,
I mentioned that a solutionary isn't just a problem solver. Solutionary also isn't a humanitarian. Solutionaries are probably also humanitarians, but they're not the same thing. So, a
right,
humanitarian is going to go and try and relieve suffering and mitigate harm. But a humanitarian's job is not to address the causes of that suffering or that harm. That's a solutionary's job. So I
right.
do think we need a new word.
And I tend to agree with you that and to me it creates a discussion space too. It's sort of like, well, it starts a conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I love Anthropocene as a word, and I think we needed that.
Yeah, and to me, again, the best thing about Anthropocene is the conversation around it.
Yeah,
Carl
exactly.
Carl Safina calls it the obscene, others call it the plasticine, others call it capitalocene, and that's how you kind of make progress
Yeah.
through discourse. Um, some of your learning curve is really interesting,
Yeah.
um, including that improv. Comedy plays a role in how you framed these ideas, and I really appreciate that. I pay attention to people who are onto issues before they became hot issues. You were writing in Psychology Today in 2019 about polarization and paths forward through it. That's before, what happened in 2020 and what's happened since. So before the pandemic, before the political chaos and the like. So what's improv got to do with it?
So my husband and I have been taking improv classes for, I don't know, maybe 20 years now. And there are rules for improv comedy, and they're foundational to being able to do improv comedy well. And as I began to learn those rules and practice them, I realized how applicable they were to solving problems in the world and honestly just to life in general. And and then when I was thinking about how they applied to being a solutionary, it was just it was such a perfect match. So there are four basic rules, and the first one is to build relationships. And the second one is to embrace this concept of yes and. And the third one is to bring the love. And the fourth one is to help others shine. So, this idea of building a relationship, when two actors come on stage and somebody throws out a title or a suggestion, they have to create a scene immediately. And the very first thing they do is they establish a relationship. So, one might say to the other one, hey, mom, I entered us into the parent child acrobatic competition at school. And so that other actor, might be male, might be 16 years old, but that other actor is going to immediately become mom because that relationship was established by the first actor. So what can happen in a situation like this is, you can have a relationship established with you, and you don't necessarily like that relationship, you don't agree with that relationship, but it doesn't matter. You accept the relationship, and then you build upon it, and you build on that relationship to drive the scene forward. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in real life is we tend to be really careful about who we build relationships with. And we avoid building relationships with people who have different beliefs than we do, whether they're political beliefs or their religious beliefs. Maybe they're based on class, maybe they're based on education, all sorts of ways
Right.
that we limit relationships. But if we can build relationships, even where it's uncomfortable, then we have the capacity now to learn from each other, to collaborate, to reduce the kind of divisiveness and polarization, because we see the humanity in another person because we have been willing to build those relationships. So I'll pause there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, i- and is there improv comedy takes a lot of guts too. It's like a danger zone for many people. I'm a musician, I'm a songwriter, and the idea of being funny to me is scary. But at least I do perform, so it must be. I don't know how you get people to have the courage to be solutionary in that sense, to take these practices into these environments that might not feel comfortable.
That is a really interesting point, Andy, because it does take it to do improv comedy in a class situation that's really safe with people who you get to know and trust and like. It doesn't take a ton of bravery, but to get on stage and do it in front of an audience, which we have done, it does take a kind of bravery. And I hadn't really thought about that before. And that relationship to being a solutionary, because being a solutionary also takes courage. It takes courage to say, that problem really bothers me, and I want to play a role in solving it. And I'm going to do what it takes to do that. And there are going to be really uncomfortable aspects of doing what it takes to solve that problem. So you're right. Courage plays a role in both.
And maybe the inverse is the fear is about vulnerability or feeling of vulnerability, or perhaps uh, being willing to accept that your impassioned view of an issue or question isn't the only one. And that's so hard for us, I think, as humans.
Yes, and I think that this is where these other improv rules really help. So the second rule, embrace yes and. So what that refers
Yeah.
to is that when there's actors on a stage, if somebody puts out some sort of idea, the other actor says yes to it, implicitly says yes to it. They don't deny it, they don't argue with it, they don't reject it, they don't say but, they say and. So they say, yeah, they fully accept that idea, and then they add to it with whatever else they use or say or do to bring the scene forward. And so this idea relates to being a solutionary because, when you come across somebody who has a very different belief system than you do, it's really important to find what you can say yes to. So sometimes I
Yeah.
use the example of pro-life and pro-choice and around the issue of abortion. And most people, wherever they lie on the spectrum of that, can agree that it would be good if as few girls and women faced an unwanted pregnancy as possible. So that's something that very avid pro-choice and very avid pro-life people could agree upon. So if we can say yes to anything, then there's the possibility of saying and how do we get there? And then it
Right.
also means that if you're hearing something that you completely disagree with, but you find that nugget that you can say yes to, then you're not rejecting this person. You're saying yes. And then the and that you're adding is your views, your perspectives. And from there, if they're willing to yes and you, they're going to find a nugget in what you said to say yes to, and they're going to add their perspective. And then maybe together we can build some sort of bridge, because we have to.
Yeah. And, this reminds me of the work of Peter Coleman, who I got to know at Columbia. He's a psychologist who, among many, many other things, built the Difficult Conversations Laboratory at Columbia. His work grows out of international conflict. He studies sustainable peace. Like, where are there places on the planet there that are weirdly peaceful, like shouldn't be peaceful given what we think we know about the world. And he taught me something early on an early webcast here, where I mentioned that uh, I I didn't like the New York Times when I was there. I didn't like this thing they created called Room for Debate. They'd get like 5 experts on a field to weigh in on something in the news. And I thought we should have room for agreement.
Mm.
And I did some posts on my .earth blog about that. And I used .earth that way. And Peter said something really, really interesting. And this shows the power of words too. He said, actually, no, you don't want room for agreement. He said, you want room for cooperation.
Mm.
And
Interesting.
cooperate, meaning that you're not demanding someone else accept a new framework, a new belief. You're saying, I'm different than you are, but we agree to cooperate on something. And that
Yeah.
feels kind of powerful.
That is, and this whole, it's interesting you should bring up debate, because I first started thinking about a lot of what I ended up writing in this book um, when this was in 2009. I was in my car and I heard an ad for the Intelligence Squared series that was held at NYU.
Mhm.
It's now called Open to Debate. And it was about whether or not the US was responsible for Mexico's drug wars. And I remember as soon as I heard it thinking like, huh? Why is there going to be a debate about that question? Why are these experts, these people who are so knowledgeable about this issue, going to come in and argue whether or not the US is responsible for Mexico's drug wars, instead of bringing in experts to talk about how do we solve this problem, and what are the underlying problems,
Yeah.
poverty and inequity and lack of education and addiction and all these things. It seemed like not a good use of time and expertise and brilliance. And so I've actually been talking about how that whole debate format that's used in schools all over the country,
Right.
maybe we could have solutionary teams working together to solve problems, rather than debate teams just arguing what are generally manufactured arguments, right? Which
Yeah.
side are you on? And our media does this, and our
They
political
do.
system does this, and it's so antithetical to actually solving problems.
Absolutely. And to me, again, it's precisely the wrong frame for almost every one of the tough challenges of sustainability, which are not binary.
Yes,
They're
exactly.
not win lose. And I was at the 2007 the IQ squared debate on climate change, and the team that won was actually the skeptics. Michael Crichton, the writer, was on the
Mhm.
skeptics team, but it was all framed as a battle. And there's nothing about climate change that is win lose. It's all about maximizing access to clean energy, minimizing vulnerability, looking for pockets of vulnerability in your communities, thinking about the ecological impacts of development. It's those None of those are like an on off switch. And even climate itself, as Ruth DeFries at Columbia, she says these are ratchets. They're not knobs.
Yeah.
They're not off on knobs. They're part of the problem with climate is it's a ratchet. It's hard to turn it back. So I just think you're spot on there as well. There are going to be some questions coming in, which is good. There's one that's a little off. This is very specific, but I wanted to get to it because it's important right now. Whoops, where is he? Samshad Nareen, she is in Bangladesh. And she said, we're suffering from heat wave in Bangladesh. Temperature jumps to 50 C. Anyone knows centigrade Fahrenheit, this is marginally livable. Is it because of climate change? Uh, it, Climate change is a component of these great heat waves now, and they will worsen because of that. The heat impact of CO2, carbon dioxide, and the other greenhouse gases is one of the most straightforward impacts. But in cities, if you're in a city, Samshad, the urban landscape also is a big part of what makes heat particularly intense. Concrete versus trees and water. So good luck with your community wherever you are there. And I've done episodes on heat and written about it a lot in all my years. Thanks for tuning in from uh, Bangladesh. I want to get back to some of the other practices and lessons. You mentioned the importance of the discomfort zone of getting into communities and bridging gaps that we might normally want to avoid. And you have learned some lessons through your practice of fitness at a gym. And so I have this, a vegan and a hunter walk into a gym. What happens? So there are lots of lessons, I think, in fitness that relate, but what was your learning curve here? It's in the book too. And how does that relate to what people should think and do about sustainability questions?
Yeah. Well, I have to say that for me, joining a CrossFit gym was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. And I did it because I was on the verge of osteoporosis, and
Mm,
I wanted to regain my bone mass. So that's why I went there. And what I discovered was this community that was really quite extraordinary and special, because this is a community of people with vastly different views. Very conservative people, very liberal people, very religious people, atheists, like just the whole wide array of human beliefs and values. But we all come together and we support each other, and this community is built. And I have made just incredibly close friends with people who have very different beliefs than I do. So I'm the vegan in this question, and I have really good friends from CrossFit who are hunters. And what's interesting is how much we actually can agree. When I was talking about like the build relationships, this is where I can see its power every day when I
right.
go to the gym. And so, one of my really good friends at CrossFit, who's a hunter, you know, I was actually talking to him about how much less meat does he eat from like the supermarkets or restaurants because he kills one deer every year.
Right.
And he says it's probably about a third less meat from those sources, which we can all agree are um, much crueler and
Right.
much more environmentally destructive than his killing that one deer. And so, and he also cares passionately about the environment and wanting a clean and healthy environment and biodiversity and all the rest. So we have so many areas of agreement. And in fact, his choice to hunt and eat that one animal is reducing suffering toward vastly more animals in our factory farming system.
Right.
And I would say that both of us are also mushroom hunters. So
I've
we
seen your many posts on that.
we share that in common as well.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And you also, that gets at one of the points you make in the book about trade-offs, and it's all interlaced, trade-offs and finding room for cooperation, as opposed to you need to think the way I do about food or animals.
Of course, I would like for everybody to recognize the capacity of other sentient animals to experience
Sure.
harm and suffering, and to cultivate their compassion for other species, and then strive to act accordingly. You know, none of us can, on this planet, in this era, where there's so many interconnected systems in which we play a part, whether we like it or not, none of us could possibly cause no harm and do all good. But this idea of doing the most good and the least harm, or more good and less harm, is a philosophy and a principle that virtually everybody agrees is a valuable principle. So how can we put it into practice? And I think we can all strive to do better in that, because none of us is going to be perfect.
Yeah. Let's take a few minutes here to go into one of the example you opened a chapter with, which is related to a film, a Spanish film. I haven't seen the film, but it's got a pretty simple premise, and it's quite a remarkable one. Uh, I'm just going to silently play this clip. So it's a Spanish film about a baldness cure that has a very interesting um, ramification. So tell us a little bit about how that plays into your thinking. And
Oh, I thought maybe that we would hear it. Okay, yeah. So in this film, this couple, they go to treat his baldness, and they learn that there's just a pill that it costs $6,000, but you take the pill and you get a full head of hair. But there's a side effect, and the side effect is that a cousin of yours is going to die. And the person who's selling the pill says, "Look, it might be like a second or third cousin who you only see at a wedding. Like, you know, people die all the time."
right,
And the couple, obviously, they're shocked, they're horrified. But then the guy trying to sell the pill, he lets them touch his hair, because his full head of hair that you see there is because he did the treatment. That's what the film is called. So anyway, they leave, and they're obviously, you know, thinking about this. And when they get into the lobby, they run into a long lost cousin of this guy who's bald, who's coming in to have his meeting for the treatment. And it's such a when I saw the film, I just thought that is a brilliant film, because it's actually the story of our everyday lives. And we don't realize that the choices that we make, the foods we eat, the clothes we wear, the things we buy,
right,
they have impacts on other people, on ecosystems, on other species around the globe, because we're all connected through a global economic and production system. And so the choices that we make, they could be causing death, harm, destruction
right,
to others we may never see or know. And so the treatment is just a brilliant way of driving that home. And it's something we can ask ourselves: so how do we minimize that harm?
right. And that's where some of the practices or the tools and strategies come in. Um, I don't know. Maybe you could. I don't know if there's a case study you can think of. For me, I remember in Cold Spring, New York, before we moved to Maine, I was in the supermarket one day with my son Jack when he was much younger, and he liked mango juice, and there was this like it's like a trapezoidal bottle of mango juice you could buy in most markets, and I was like, where I wonder where this comes from. And I looked on the label, it came from Belgium. And then so that led to the question, well, how did the mangoes get to Belgium? And it's sort of a practice of thinking through those things. So is that how, are there other strategies you think about? Or is
Yeah.
that one?
So we use an activity that it's one of the stretchiest humane education activities that we have in our toolbox, and it's called True Price. And in True Price, we look at an everyday object. It could be a fast food burger, it could be bottled water, it could be a cell phone, and we ask, what are the effects of this item, both positive and negative, and through the procurement of the resources, through production and disposal, on me as an individual consumer of it, on other people, on animals, and on the environment. That takes research, right? To,
Right.
it's one question with many parts. But we can do that research. That's actually the second phase of the solutionary process, is to investigate, to really learn about the causes of problems and the impacts. And so True Price is just a little microcosm of that. And so we ask those questions. And then the next question we ask are what are the systems that make this item so commonplace? And are there any alternatives that would do more good and less harm? And if there aren't, what systems would need to change? And if
Right.
there are alternatives, how could we make those alternatives the norm? So what systems would need to change? So it's like it's a little activity that you can do so easily with any item. So you did it with mango juice.
Right. Right. That's great. And tell us a little bit about the Institute and how these ideas that you have together bundled together in this book and a previous one that's more of a guidebook for teachers. How does that play in classrooms and out from those classrooms into the world?
So, one of the pieces about for going on this solutionary journey is to ask yourself a few questions. What issues really concern me? What problems do I want to solve? That's the first question. The next question is, what am I good at? And the last question is, what do I love to do? If you can find the place where the answers to those questions meet, then you're going to be doing something you're good at that you enjoy doing in service of a greater good. So I discovered, after a somewhat circuitous journey, that I was good at teaching and I loved teaching. And what were the issues I cared about? Well, I pretty much cared about all human rights issues, all animal issues, and all environmental issues. How could I put all of that together? And I became a humane educator who teaches about the interconnected issues of human rights and animal protection and environmental sustainability, with the goal of educating people to be solutionaries. So at the Institute for Humane Education, we have worked to shift what happens in schools, because the education of young people is the root system underlying all other societal systems. So if we want a healthy future, we have to ensure that we're educating for it. Now, it's a long-term solution. And so because it's a long-term solution, we also have to make sure that everybody becomes a solutionary, which is why I wrote this book. I wrote it for anybody who wants to solve problems. But in terms of our work at the Institute for Humane Education, we're working with schools, we're working with teachers. We have the only graduate program in humane education in the country that interconnects these issues through the field of education. And we offer those graduate programs online through an affiliation with Antioch University. So we're currently working around the globe. As I mentioned, we're on 6 continents. We're in almost 20 countries right now. We're working deeply in different parts of the US. And right now we're working with the Maine Department of Education to train 200 teachers by September to bring the solutionary framework into Maine schools. Since Maine is where we are headquartered, it's really exciting to work within a geographically large but population small state and really have an impact here that we hope will spread around the country and the world.
Yeah, Maine. I'm getting to know this wonderful state. I grew up in the smallest state in Rhode Island, and Maine does sprawl. And rural education here and in so many places is such a huge challenge. Do you worry sometimes about how to get these tools and this thinking into school systems that are least able to find it and reach for it and integrate it into what they do?
Well, I think that's why it's so exciting to be working in Maine, because we're in
Right.
every county in Maine. And as we know, Maine has a lot of poverty, and there are very rural areas that don't have as many resources, but we are in those areas. So, and we're also working in 2 schools in Chicago, and we're working around the Bay Area in California. And so we're in a lot of different places, and this kind of education is needed everywhere. So,
Absolutely.
we're committed to making sure that everybody can get it. And toward that end, if a teacher wants to go through our solutionary micro-credential program to bring this to their students, and their school cannot afford to have them go through it, we will scholarship them in. So we don't say no to anybody. We're working right now in Kenya, and we provide all of the training in Kenya free of charge. And the teachers there, we're working with dozens of teachers, and they're in some of the most marginalized and poorest communities.
Wow. That's great. And I assume a good way for people to find out more, I'm posting periodically the book, thesolutionaryway.org. You also have, anyone can just search for Humane Education and Institute, and you'd find a lot more of the teacher resources. And there's a whole nother book and guide for teachers as well.
Right. The world becomes what we teach, educating a generation of solutionaries.
Right. There's a question posted by Heidi Vierthaler, who's been on watching these shows for a long time. It's a little, she's in a hurry. I guess it's a reluctant carnivore question. She needs the protein. Need to watch later, but wanted to share this with you as soon as possible. How can we get the same protein from meat and dairy through vegetables, etc.? This is a little off the track, but it's certainly a relevant question for you, I'm sure.
It is. Well, it's interesting because I'm trying to achieve this very hard thing at right now. By the time my book comes out, and it comes out 3 weeks from today, and I'm trying to achieve a ring muscle up. And just Google ring muscle up, and you can see what it is. It's a very difficult gymnastics move. And my really good friend and the owner of CrossFit Acadia, he has insisted upon me eating more protein, and he wants my protein intake, up to 118 grams of protein per day. I only weigh 102 pounds. So this is I have to eat tons of protein, and I've been vegan for 35 years this month. I am managing to eat this level of protein. So I would just say to this listener, anything like this can just be Googled, but there's a lot of protein in tofu and seitan. And, I use a vegan protein powder, and I have a protein smoothie every day. And it's not that hard. You do have to, if you really want that much protein, you're doing a lot of math, but it's just not that hard.
Yeah. Well, this is hard. I can tell you from what I'm seeing here. So June 25th, huh?
Yeah, I know.
Wow.
Fingers crossed, Andy. But here's the thing. I don't want to say, I don't want to put it in my head that I might not reach this goal, but it's possible I might not reach this goal. And you know what? If I don't reach this goal by June 25th, then I extend that goal, right? Like we may not, this is a parallel to being a solutionary. We're going to have problems that we want to solve. For me, achieving a ring muscle up is a problem I want to solve. And we may not achieve it as fast as we want. We're going to have roadblocks along the way. We're going to face obstacles. How do we meet those? How do we keep going? How do we shift if we need to shift either our goal or the people who we work with, the collaborators? What do we need to do to achieve the goal? And that's, what you talk about in Sustain What too. Like, there isn't this endpoint beyond trying to create a more sustainable, a more peaceful, a more just, a more compassionate future. And we just stay on that trajectory.
Yeah, for sure. And this gets back to something we touched on briefly. When I was, I could give it another kind of way at it. When I was at National Geographic Society on staff around 2017 for about a year, the organization was going through some big changes. This is after being around since the 1880s. And briefly, there was a new vision, a new kind of mission statement, which was around seeking a planet in balance. And this, my first question would always be, what does that mean? Is this balance like we won the environmental war, now we're all sitting by the shore of the lake sipping martinis? Or does it mean hot yoga balance? tension, balance through dynamic tension
Mhm.
and work. And I do feel it's much more the latter. There's no simple endpoint. And that's where fitness, discipline, having that, I used to talk about properties, system properties, and properties in people that feel like the right fit for the sustainability question. And one of them is simply repeating, repeat, reflect, repeat. In other words,
Mhm.
reflect on where you are and repeat or iterate. So the gym um, framing, which something I'm bad at still, although I'm up to 40 push-ups a day, so I feel good about that. It feels appropriate. Is that part of it? Are you in shape because you realize this is a life's work that you then pass on, or?
Um, there's a couple things that you've just said that I wanna touch on. So,
Mhm.
um, for me, I started this fitness journey as medicine, and it quickly became, even if I don't increase my bone mass, which I did, by the way, and doctors said you can't increase your bone mass. Well, I did significantly, but I would have kept it going anyway because the community, the support, everything I've learned, the building relationships across very wide differences has been so fantastic. But what you just said about iterate, so, I started off talking about how the first phase of the solutionary process is to identify a problem you want to solve. And then the next phase is investigate, really understand its causes. The third phase is innovate the solution, right? So that's where you're finding leverage points and you're coming up with ideas. The final phase is implement, but in each of these phases, there are three steps. And in the implement phase, one of those steps is you assess and you iterate. It's not a process that ends with implementation. You're constantly evaluating and iterating. So
Yeah.
I felt like that comment you made was perfect segue to get back to that framework.
Yeah, and this, there's an emotional component here too, because um, keeping the emotional stamina for dealing with problems, especially in the environment I described at the beginning of this webcast.
Mhm.
We have multiple dimensions of turbulence and change, and some of them may be really hammering you in one aspect of your day, but you still have your thing that you've identified. How important is just basic emotional um, resilience, and how do you develop that? What's the key there? And
Yeah, it's a really, really important question. So for me, actually, fitness is very helpful with that. All those endorphins, like feeling good and getting all those endorphins is a great way to just plain feel better. Um, the the beauty of the solutionary process is that it's not just solving problems external to you. It's building community, it's building collaboration, it's I have found that this work has just brought the most amazing people into my life. I mean, Andy, just thinking about how I know you, it's because your wife reached out to me when you were moving to Maine because she knew about my work and we connected and then we all connected and that's because of that's because of our mutual work that we actually connected. So I feel like this effort to be a solutionary brings incredible people into my life. And that, of course, makes my life enriched. But I don't spend all day, every day, immersed in terrible things in the world. I go
right.
out for walks with my dogs. I spend lots of time in nature. These things restore me so that I can do this work. And I just want to say one more thing about this because I don't want to sound Pollyannish about this. I mean, yes, when you do this work and you see its impacts, then you build this sense of evidence-based optimism. But I do not always feel optimistic. I'm generally a pretty optimistic person and it's generally evidence-based. I have seen lots and lots of things get better over the course of my lifetime, even as plenty of things are not good. But one doesn't need to always have hope to keep doing this work. And there are two really powerful quotes that I recite in my head all the time. One is from Joan Baez, the singer-songwriter, who said, "Action is the antidote to despair." And the other one is a little more poetic, and it comes from David Orr, who's a professor at Oberlin College. And he said, "Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up." So when we are feeling most hopeless is when we've got to get in there and do work. And because as we do that, we rebuild our sense of hope. And so it's one of those feedback loops. And it's kind of like fitness, right? Like if you
Right.
don't do fitness, you become unfit and you don't want to do fitness.
Right.
And if you don't work to make the world better and you see everything going to hell, then you feel less inclined to try and do anything because you don't believe it's going to make a difference. And you just have to, that first bit of motivation is all it takes to get into the feedback loop that's going to support that work.
And I think the other aspect of what you just described and part of your practice also is sharing the moments of restorative experience, and including on the thing called the internet, social media. Your Facebook, your Facebook feed is full of living things that aren't human beings. The alewives coming up the rivers here in Maine, and that to me, the connectivity that we have electronically, we often see as such a detriment. But if you use it in the right ways, you can build remarkable relationships. I'm sure the work you do in Africa didn't just magically happen, or because someone had to travel there. Because it was because of connections that were made
Exactly.
virtually.
Exactly.
Um, Dan Siegel, a psychiatrist at UCLA, I've got a bunch of his books here. He's a student of the mind, and he has this really interesting concept of the mind as having both a what he calls a me map and a we map.
Mm,
And a big chunk of what we think of as our mind is actually out in the world. It's our relationships with other humans, other non-human beings, and that we map can be expanded. I feel electronically if you use it correctly, and also at the local town meeting. One thing that I love here in Maine, as with the gym, is the town meetings are you're face to face with red and blue politics, and people find ways to work out. Here in Lemoyne, where we live, there's never a debate about the school budget. There's lots of debates about other things. And so finding both that capacity to build community online as we're doing right now and face to face is great. It's been wonderful to connect with you this way. Hopefully we'll be taking a walk sometime soon here in our shared landscape. I want to just ask you one last question as we come toward the end of this hour, and it's really great to have this discussion. Let me just so again, you have this grand vision. You have concrete sets of ways to pursue the vision, not necessarily achieve an outcome, but achieve a better dynamic on the planet. I think that's a key. Let me just go here. As always, I got to ask what success looks like. To me, it's not sitting on the shore of a lake. And there's this example in Minnesota, which I've done some work with. There are these rural climate dialogues and rural energy dialogues. There are ways for people to get together and communities come up with their own sense of what clean energy can look like, and what a resilient landscape can look like. I've written many pieces on my webcast about community capacity for resilience. So for you, from my reading of the book and from what I know about you, it's less about a rainbow at the end of a journey than it is about the journey.
yes. So if I think of what success looks like, it's a solutionary movement. It's people wanting to go on this journey and cultivate this practice and resist binary thinking and resist either or scenarios. And the more of us who want to go on that journey, the greater the chance that we build a real solutionary movement that can address all the challenges that we face. I don't know what the outcomes look like, but I know what the process looks like. And that process is enriching for the individuals who go on it. It's enriching for communities, it's enriching for our country and for our planet.
That's a wonderful way to encapsulate things. And the more I can do to help broaden the number of people who are on that journey, the better. Thanks for what you do. Thanks for the humane education work and for the new book. I hope it succeeds and gets out to everyone it should get to. And it's great to connect with you here, Zoe.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. I so appreciate your support, and I love your blurb for my book, and I really appreciate you inviting me to spend this hour together.
All right. And for anyone watching or now or later, this will be shareable momentarily on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and X, and I'll even post some version of it on Instagram. So, and get on with your days, and feel free to get in touch with me by looking at that distracting scrolling bar at the bottom. And as I say here, the book is at thesolutionaryway.org. Zoe Weil, good luck with your, what do you call that move you have to do?
Oh, the muscle up. And it's
The muscle
actually,
up.
it's the solutionaryway.com, but people
Oh,
can find it. It may be, we may have a .org also,
okay.
but if people go to our website or just, Google the Solutionary Way, and they'll find it.
That's great. And thanks again. I'll make sure that whoops, you can also go there. Humane Education. The book is on the main website as well. Thanks
Yes.
again.
Thank
And be
you.
well.
You too.
This is Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What, my webcast, and you can subscribe to the related newsletter on Substack at revkin.substack.com. Hold on one second.